Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Okayest Trapper Podcast. We are brought to you, as always, by Mountain Tough Fitness. And if you sign up today, you can receive a free 30-day trial by using the promo code Okayest30, all caps. We also have two new sponsors for the show, which are helping us keep the lights on. The first is Trapline Beard Oil. This is a guy who provides handmade beard oil and soap products that are tough enough for the trap line. And we're also brought to you by Blokes Modern Men's Health. Blokes is a fully online supplement company that is changing the game for men's health. If you sign up with the promo code Zach Hansen, all caps, you can get blood work done and get tailored products at 15% off that would cover any of your deficiency. You know, if you're deficient in iron, you have low thyroid, testosterone, whatever it is, they can find something that'll fit your needs. Now, today's guest is someone I am ecstatic to be talking to because I am looking forward to learning a whole bunch of stuff that I just don't know a lot about. He's a hunter, a trapper, and also happens to be Idaho Fish Game's fur-bearer biologist. Cory Mosby, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah. So, Cory, one of the questions I always ask guests right out of the gate, what is your first core memory of ever being exposed to trapping?
I got two core memories. The first one is finding a bunch of old Blake and Lamb 1.5 long springs in my dad's shed, because he was like so many folks that in the fur boom in the early 80s got into trapping and then got out of it. And so by the time I came along, they were just hung up and forgotten in a corner. He showed me how to set them, and he was a busy man that worked swing shifts at a factory and kind of left me to my own devices. And a neighbor's cat was using our family's sandbox for its toilet site. And my mom caught me trying to set a trap for that cat when I was like 5 or 6 years old. I guess as like redemption or something. I wasn't allowed to keep the trap set, but that's probably the first memory I have. And then the first one, as far as on a trap line, is when I was in junior high. My parents let me have a 4-wheeler to kind of extend my range. We lived in the country, and it was the very first animal I ever caught. It was a muskrat. So
too cool. Now, where was this at? Was this Idaho? Was this Midwest? Like, where were you growing up?
I like to jokingly call it like the north end of the South. I'm from the very southeast corner of Missouri, pretty close to the Mississippi River. It's pancake flat. It used to all be bottomland hardwood swamp. And today it's cotton, rice, corn, soy, watermelons. Like, it's an incredibly productive agricultural area. And unlike what we see out west, where all of the infrastructure is built to get water to the crops, where I grew up, all the infrastructure is built to keep the water off the landscape long enough to grow crops. So all of those big drainage ditches were public land. And so that's where I cut my teeth, was water trapping in these big ditches that were built in the early 20th century with steam shovels to drain the swamps and make farmland.
Where is that in relation to Rolla, Missouri?
Oh man, Rolla's like way up in the hill country. I'm like 3.5 hours southeast of there.
Okay.
I'm the little part that dips down into Arkansas, right next to the Mississippi River.
Okay. It's a lot of waterfowl and a lot of things like that. Okay.
Yeah, like growing up, deer and turkey were these nearly mythical animals, but we had lots of ducks, snow geese, a few specks, and then water trapping was like the charismatic megafauna for where I grew up.
So that gap between when you tried to catch your neighbor's cat with your dad's old traps from the fur boom to actually getting your first muskrat, that was several years, but what drew you in? Because clearly by the time you were in junior high school, like fur prices, things like that were not high. So what was the draw? Was it other friends that were trapping? Was it family? What was it?
No, that's kind of, it's far enough south that there isn't a whole lot of a market for the pelts in that part of our country. And it was just, I guess I was just born with it. There's always been an infatuation with the natural world. And my particular flavor of that infatuation has always been around the harvesting of animals, like hunting, fishing, trapping, raking crawdads for crawfish boils, like all of it. Like that's, it has always been my thing. As soon as I was old enough to have a BB gun, it was, the starlings and house sparrows were under constant attack, and it's never changed. It's just evolved and grown since then.
Let me ask a question. And I feel like I might know the answer, and it might come from a few different books. But as a young man, maybe middle, going into high school, what was your favorite book?
Ooh.
I'll give you some answers that a lot of people say. I usually hear
I'm trying to think. I've always been a pretty voracious reader. My whole family are like big book nerds. But growing up, I really loved Hatchet. I stumbled across like the Tom Brown's Wilderness Survival books when I was a little kid and was really infatuated with those. And then completely non-related is I've always loved like all of the fantasy stuff. So like The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Those still count as adventure books, I think.
Yeah, adventure, outdoors. But oh man, like the Hatchet, and he wrote another one called The Hay Meadow about a young man that is sent up into the high mountains to watch after a sheep herd on an allotment, like in the mountains out west. And those are some of my earliest like chapter books that I remember really loving.
Yeah, and with that, then you obviously had that penchant, like you said, for the outdoors. As soon as you got a BB gun, you were reading those books. What were you doing when you started that muskrat trapping in those kind of old canals you were talking about? Like, how did you get introduced to that? Was it a mentor? Like, were you just going out with a conibear and kind of testing the literal waters? Like, how'd you go about that? And then the follow-up question is, what was it like when you came up on your first catch?
Gotcha. So back to books, the NTA trapping handbook that is almost has like children's like not diagrams, but illustrations in it. That was in my county, Dunklin County library, and I had that. And my dad showed me a couple of things, but I think in this generation we take for granted the access to information. And then in the early 90s, that access to information was like my best friend's great grandpa, who was a farmer and still kind of trapped a little bit on like the irrigation ditches behind his house, and showed us how to set a conibear in a run, or how to look for a feed bed under an undercut bank for a rat, and like where to set the trap there, or how to set a submersion rig for a raccoon. But really, like, I didn't have access to YouTube, or I didn't even find any of the trapping books that like Tom Krause and Milligan and all those people wrote until I was in college. So it was that NTA trapping handbook, and then like anything I could glean from my community. And then it was just playing around in the water.
Did you have success initially, or did it take a while before you had your first connection on a muskrat?
We had pretty good success. It was me and my best friend growing up. We both each had a four-wheeler, and I'm not trying to sound like an old curmudgeon, but I guess it was a little bit of different times. Like I was allowed to have a combination 22 shotgun. I'm an old Savage external hammer, and carry that on the four-wheeler to shoot cottontail rabbits and dispatch animals in my traps. And I remember what is funny is the first bridge in the first ditch that we trapped on, I remember we set like 15 or 20 traps at like everything that looked good. So we like carpet bombed the quarter of a mile on both sides of the water on that ditch. And I remember that first check, we caught a buck mink, which was really cool. And then that muskrat, which was actually the first animal we saw in the trap. We caught two animals that day, but it was a rat and a buck mink. And a fun thing about the buck mink is, this great grandfather figure, Clay Johnson, was trapped back when mink were, one of the more valuable animals on like a per unit basis, on like an inch of fur basis. And he wouldn't let us skin that. He would let us skin the rat, but the mink, and he wanted to skin it out with the feet, which is not something you would see in any of the like FHA manuals nowadays. But he was taught how to do this in probably the 60s. So these are things I pick up now in memory, but I never would have thought about it when I was 13 years old.
Well, it's funny, like, as a 13-year-old, you kind of nailed a question that I had, which is, you mentioned the pelt quality in that region, and maybe the time you were trapping wasn't, worth selling or whatever the case may be, but you ended up skinning it out, right? Because I know there's some places like Louisiana, essentially there's bounties on like nutria where you can turn in tails or whatever. But with where you were at, you actually did skin them though. And did you end up selling them? Did you keep them? Did you tan them? What was kind of the MO of high school years?
I don't remember what book it was, but I got something where you could use alum or borax. And so I was very into stealing bits of scrap plywood from my dad's shop and tacking out my pelts on flat boards and tanning them like that.
Did you do any like
a sophomore? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, did you end up doing any sewing and making your own hats and mittens?
No, I never went down that far down into it. I think it sounds cool. Even today, I've just never taken the plunge.
Awesome. And you're doing this, you're running your trap lines. Did this go through high school? And it sounds like even into college. And then the next question is that path, like, where did you go to school? What did you study? And then were you keeping up with your trapping and your hunting and everything else all at the same time? Or did you take breaks along the way?
Okay. Yeah. So, I went to high school in my hometown of Malden, Missouri, and I trapped, hunted, fished through all of those years. I went to undergrad at the University of Missouri in Columbia, so at Mizzou Tigers. Mm-hmm. And I pursued a degree in wildlife and fisheries sciences, so a wildlife emphasis, and also a forestry degree. Because where I grew up, like the wild lands weren't rangelands or the prairie, it was the forest. It was the Ozarks. And so that was the wildest thing that I knew of. And so the forestry degree also seemed important to me. And I trapped all through college. And then...
Where did you trap in? So, fun fact, I did live in Columbia, Missouri for about a year. Like actually up closer to Mexico, like up near those little Finger Lakes that are just north of there. I wasn't trapping at the time. I had no idea about it even. But where were you trapping during college? And what did that look like? Were you the guy bringing a muskrat into the dorm room to skin it? Like, what was your college experience around?
It was mostly on college breaks. So until the first 2 years when I lived in the dorms, I would trap on Thanksgiving and then Christmas break because, a full week for Thanksgiving and then a month off for Christmas. And I would either go back home and trap, but that's when I started. Like I attended my first Missouri Trappers Association, their version of a rendezvous, and got to watch a demo, and that was really cool. And I got a couple of books like Tom Krause's like Dynamite, Mink, and Muskrat Trapping, and found some online trapline stores, and that's when I really went down the rat hole, so to speak. And so I'd go back home and trap. And that was Missouri had successfully reintroduced otters, which is a really cool trapping and furbearer conservation success story throughout North America. But in Missouri, the southeast portion of the state where I live, that's when we have a really healthy population of river otter. And that's when prices were really high. So I would go back home and trap for a month and catch a pile of beaver and then 4 or 5 river otter, and just basically envision myself as a modern day Jim Bridger. Because, otters are worth $150, $200 a pop, and that's 2003. And none of us do it for the money, but it felt cool that there was an end user for the product that I loved the lifestyle around it so much.
And for those who don't know, even though Mizzou is a football school, it's relatively rural. Like it's a small city. It's a
Yeah, Columbia, when I was there, I think it was like 80 or 100,000 people. Mizzou's our big flagship university in the state.
Yeah.
It's like 25,000 undergrads when I was there. And then the big fun thing that I did in undergrad is I had a friend that family lived in Northwest Missouri in like Carroll County.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went up there, and 4 of us, and we split into like 2 groups and would float rivers that fed into the Missouri in that like cornfield and like bottomland hardwood stuff, and trap raccoons. And, in like 5 days of trapping, the 4 of us caught 125 raccoons, and we envisioned ourselves as like true professionals. And those are still really fond memories.
Yeah. And did you ever like when you're sitting at the bar there in Missouri, like, do you tell people you trap? Like, what was the perception in 2003 of like a modern day Jim Bridger, a guy who's going out on his holiday breaks to go home and trap river otters and beaver, or go take a special trip up to trap raccoons in, a different part of the state? Was it like a head scratcher for people at the time, or was it kind of like, oh yeah, this makes sense?
I think it's always novel. Like, a lot of people don't know that this activity is still alive and well in the country. But no, I don't think I ever got anything too bad. And like most of our classes, you're taking like forest ecology and mammalogy and biometrics, so like how to use statistics to infer trends in animal populations. So whether the people hunted or not, they are just only like one step removed from the idea that we manage and harvest wildlife. So no, It was never a big deal. And I'm using Jim Bridger really generously. I mean, my car was a hurricane damaged Hyundai Elantra that I would tie a big Sears and Roebuck aluminum canoe on top. Like, it was pretty goofy, but it worked.
Hey, I'm from the South, like South Carolina, Georgia,
Uh-huh.
and I have a trope, right? Real rednecks don't drive lifted trucks that are really nice. Real rednecks drive minivans with a busted out window with duct tape over it, trying to just make do. So, I think the modern character works. But help me bridge the gap. So you graduate, you've got this degree, you have this interest, you're still a hunter, you're still a trapper. At what point do you migrate west and start to kind of work in this field of like what you're doing now, which is furbearer biology?
That was very early on. My first, I had a great professor, a great mentor. There are many great professors, but one mentor in particular, Josh Millspaugh, who's now at the University of Montana, took a special interest in development of undergraduates, and he really drove home that in our career field, the work experience that you get as a technician working in the summers or those critical years after undergrad and before grad school are so important. So my freshman year of college, me and a friend this was still like finding a 3-ring binder with job applications. And we sent off like 25 applications, and the Pacific Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service was hiring people to basically like go measure trees in the Sierra Nevadas of California. And so we loaded up his truck and lived in tents for a summer east of Fresno up in the mountains and measured trees. And when I saw what that landscape was and better understood what the percentage of land and public land ownership, and I was done. Like, I was going to try and figure it out after that. I mean, all of our country is beautiful. How long? I mean, I graduated in December of 2006, and in January 2007, my job was working for a nonprofit in Yellowstone National Park. And then I lived in Cook City, which is at the northeast entrance to the park, and did behavioral work on coyotes, foxes, and wolves. And I've never been back east since, or never been back to my home state to live and work really since then.
Gotcha. And then when did the transition over to the great state of Idaho happen?
Ooh, that one's a circuitous route. I ended up, in our career of like wildlife biology, it's a good opportunity to live and work all over the country. So, I did tech work in Missouri, California and New Mexico and South Dakota. And then I went to grad school at South Dakota State University, and my graduate work was on the population ecology of bobcats. And then after that, I ended up going and working in Alaska for a season for the Park Service. And then I ended up in South Africa for about 9 months. And then I ended up in Grand Canyon National Park in Arizona for 3 years. And then I was the state of Maine's furbearer biologist for 3 years. And I really missed the West and public land and big game hunting and being able to, like, as long as you're on federal land, you can pitch your tent, you can go on your hike, you can set your trap. And started perusing all of the state job sites back out west, and Idaho popped up with a furbearer biologist position. And it was on my short list of places I wanted to build a life. So I threw my name in the hat.
And it sounds like that name was drawn.
Yep. I've been here about 6.5 years and really enjoy it.
That's cool. And for those who don't know, are you out of the Nampa field office? Is that your main base of operations, or are you in the new one that's in downtown
Boise? It's the new one in downtown Boise. Yeah, that's our headquarters office.
Okay. Well, now riddle me this. 6.5 years in this role. What is the day in a life of a fur-bearer wildlife biologist in the Mountain West?
Oh, man. It is... I like to joke that we... it's... If you can see where I'm at, like, I'm in an office. And for better or for worse, that's where probably 3/4 of my time is in an office. And as far as what a day in the life is like, it varies by season, but a lot of my work at this point is project management. So I'm hiring technicians to collect data for whatever species that's a high priority. Maybe it's a high priority like wolverine because they were recently listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Or maybe it's a high priority for something like river otter, because a lot of Idaho's trappers have an interest in more opportunity to harvest that species, or bobcats. But I'm helping put together the projects that we need to collect the data that's going to inform a decision one way or another. And so really, like, I'm just collecting that information. Our commission, our leaders, policy will do what they will with that data, but that's really my role. And that's really facilitated through things that I think it's kind of funny. It's no different than so many other professions. It's like managing budgets, maintaining relationships, like managing my fleet of vehicles and snowmobiles. And no, they're not mine, but like we work with the state, keeping up with all of that equipment. Like facilitating meetings with the Forest Service, getting permits to place cameras in wilderness areas, like all of the administrative grind that goes with managing a system.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. And it sounds like, well, let me ask this question first, and I'll have a follow-up, but like, out of all of that, and it might be philosophical too, but like, what's the hardest part of your job year in and year out?
The hardest part of my job year in and year out is probably I think it's probably like the managing of priorities, because like the furbearer program is really important to a lot of people, and me obviously, but our state agency has to juggle a whole lot of pretty big issues in the world of conservation and wildlife fisheries management. And so just waiting for your chance to get into this, to like get up to bat can be challenging sometimes. And you learn pretty quickly it's patience and a long game.
Yeah.
So that can feel like a grind sometimes.
It sounds like any job anywhere.
Yeah. And then probably the other piece is, without going into too much like of a rabbit hole, the disconnect sometimes between like science and policy decisions. And as a biologist, you may view a decision as being contrary to the data, and that's just part of like the messy part of like science and policy and managing wildlife.
Yeah, I can't imagine how hard that is. But the nice thing and what I love about part of Idaho, I don't know if this was just happenstance or part of the job requirement, but you yourself have been trapping since you were a young kid. So you are a trapper, which is, I don't know if that's a rarity for state agencies, but it's one that I appreciate as a trapper myself, to have a trapper who's in the position that you are in as you're kind of evaluating, doing studies, things like that. But with that, trapping always seems to be the low-hanging fruit if we're thinking about things that are attacked, right? Especially if you're looking at anti-hunter groups, things like that. What would you say is one of the biggest just misconceptions about modern trapping that the public probably holds?
That these participants in trapping, our trappers, our trapping license holders, are this capital driven. They're out there to just kill as much as they can to make money, and for all sort of budgetary and philosophical reasons that couldn't be farther from the truth. And then I think all that kind of unfolds itself into this perception that trappers don't have empathy for the animals that they kill, or that that it's a cruel activity, and yeah.
And that's actually a good segue too to a question about like BMPs, like the best management programs, Association for Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and the work they're doing. I've seen even when I think back to myself before I started trapping, like it's easy to have this caricature of like a trap of like what you'd see in a cartoon, which couldn't be further from the truth. But does Idaho Fish and Game, is there any involvement or connection with like AFWA and developing BMPs? And for those listening who don't know what that is a set of guidelines for different types of traps, restraining devices that meet certain criteria that meet ethical standards of trapping, holding animals largely uninjured. But is Idaho Fish and Game, are they involved with that as well, or is that kind of two separate organizations?
Well, AFWA exists to like serve the state fish and wildlife agencies of the country, as well as like Canadian provinces in some ways. But I mean, yeah, Idaho Fish and Game is involved with the AFWA furbearer technical working group, in the sense that like I'm a member of that working group. I chair their outreach committee. So yeah, I mean, in the sense that like I'm involved with helping identify which traps are going to be tested for what species, and then how do we try and roll that information out. How do we, like, the different outreach products that we provide to state agencies. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely involved in that way in the process. I think in our state we have AFWA's BMP program has partnered with trappers to test traps for us. And then like in our trapper education programs, we do incorporate the BMPs as like another tool for new trappers to gather information to help make their decisions and what type of traps they may want to buy for pursuing whatever furbearer of choice.
And going off of that too, like why is trapping as a conservation or management tool vital for maintaining healthy populations of animals in the Mountain West?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I mean, trapping in general, it really provides this like plethora of products to your average citizen, to ecosystems, whether you trap or not, or whether you live in the downtown Boise or rural Oahe County. And there's a few different things. Like I think one that I find really fascinating as a biologist is that Idaho Fish and Game is charged through our mission to manage, monitor, maintain all wildlife species. There's obviously not enough money and resources to do all of that. through trapping, we have an engaged user group that contributes and has a vested interest in maintaining these healthy populations, whether it's a coyote or a muskrat or a bobcat. And they're going to go and, through their effort, harvest animals, collect data that I use for everything from tracking the status and distribution of those populations in our state. So are they healthy? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? To special one-off projects where I like partner with trappers to collect genetic samples from marten to better understand the distribution of the two species of marten in Idaho. So from like a selfish perspective of like, with what my position is charged with doing, trappers are our single largest source of data collection in monitoring the status of that animal, of that suite of species. And then another one, and I think it's important not to overplay it, but it can help maintain a balance of that population in relation to other needs. Mm-hmm. So, harvesting beaver in areas that there's going to be consistent conflict because of irrigation infrastructure. Instead of having to pay someone to kill that animal out of season, like what you see in a state like Massachusetts that's lost their right to trap, you have a person that wants to buy a license and then often during the harvest season, harvest that animal, utilize it as a product. It's part of their lifestyle, and it's still addressing that conflict need, as well as, if I'm addressing any sort of wildlife-human conflict, like animals getting into chicken coops or depredating livestock. People like to think that's never important until it's the paper birch that they planted with their daughter in their backyard, and now a beaver has girdled half of it. And then all of a sudden, that tree is wicked important, and it should be important. And trappers can help, and they do help address things like that. And then, another one is, it all probably depends on the species and the conversation, but it can help just maintain a balance in that population and mediate population growth, especially in areas where you have a lot of other interests or needs going on, and how that landscape is being utilized by people.
Yeah.
So that's a few. I mean, we could keep going, but that's
I love that. And, I think a lot of trappers maybe don't get to hear this side of it. People think state agencies, federal agencies bad, but at the end of the day, you yourself are a trapper, and this is all about keeping healthy populations for us to trap. And as you were mentioning, thankfully we live in a great state where you can go get your fur bearer license. You can go out and help reduce some of these conflicts we might be seeing, or help that person who's got a beaver gobbling that, paper birch tree they planted with their daughter. But how much does your department actually rely on trappers? Because I know we have every year, I've gotten it every year that I've had my license, like the fur bearer harvest report. I've gotten the little packages for, if I'm able to, turning in bobcat jaws. I've worked with you in the past for, like you said, getting marten samples, things like that. For trappers listening, how important are those things to be active in if you're able to?
It's incredibly important. That's another big one. It's like I have to take a breath and think about how I want to direct my response, or else I could just talk and talk. Let's start with the fur taker harvest report form. I mean, I know that it's mandatory, and I think some people may see that as burdensome. But when you fill that out and send that in, you're contributing to our state's largest, most comprehensive data set on the status of those species of fur bearers in the state. And because it's mandatory, we get really good participation, and it has therefore created one of the better data sets for this suite of species in the country. There's not a lot of states that have that level of harvest data for that many years. And, it is coarse in the sense that it's at a county level, but we're not micromanaging fur bearers like the way we need to do something like with mountain goats or something. So it really fits the need. So that's incredibly valuable. When I think we're pretty safe currently in a state like Idaho, but when I was the fur bearer biologist in Maine, there's constant critique, and that's the right of it states citizens about how we manage their resource, like their fur bearers, whether you trap or not. And in the absence of data, when someone comes to you and says, you're expanding the bobcat season, I've never seen a bobcat, and I'm afraid y'all are just killing all of these animals and are going to drive them to extinction. That may sound a bit dramatic, but I mean, I have fielded those phone calls. I went to public hearings and had to field those questions. And when you don't have data, the person, as a state agency, like as we should be, I'm restricted to using the best data I have to inform the conversation. Mm-hmm. People who don't think we should be trapping that bobcat because they've never seen one can use whatever they feel like is most empowering to them. And so the data is the best tool I have to inform that conversation and say, well, actually, like the reason we expanded the season is because we've seen an uptick in catch per unit efforts, suggesting there are more bobcats than there were 15 years ago. And we can corroborate, we can compare that to other forms of data we have, like back in Maine, you could have like vehicle strike databases or bow hunter observation reports. And you're like, all these lines are trending upwards. And then we collect jaws and we say the age and sex structure is stable, which suggests a stable to increasing population. And that's why I think we can sustain a larger harvest. But if we don't have that data, it's a I said, you said thing. And that doesn't work very well.
And that's a great segue actually into a question I had. So I'm in the Southwest region. I do a lot of water trapping. I've been up against the wall on, catching an otter right as quotas closing. And, big regions have some small numbers, but I know this season there was an increase in otter quota. By a trapper's perspective, you might be like, that's not a big increase, but, maybe walk me through like the otter quota and the story behind it, and maybe why we had the increase, which is probably supported by data, and what we might be able to expect in the future around trapping otters in Southwest Idaho.
Yeah. So, otter, of all of Idaho's fur bearers that have an open season, otters are more conservatively harvested and managed than any of our other species. And I think of that as a function of, well, historically, I mean, I think it's so funny. We are quick to forget that a lot of these species were quite rare, like just one generation ago. Like by the early to mid 1900s, I think otters were extirpated in like 25 states of the 49 that they reside in. So that's not a trivial thing. Mm-hmm. And while Idaho never had otters extirpated, they were quite rare historically. And it wasn't until, if I'm not mistaken, like 2000 that we had our first river otter season. And so since then, if you'll look at that as a saga, like over time, there has been a continual increase in season length and in quotas as the department like cautiously provided more opportunity as they felt the population could sustain that. And so, I mean, I'm trying to think where to go next. And then I guess like where we're at today, there has been an increased interest in like trappers would like to have more opportunity to harvest river otters. And so in response to that, over the past 2 years, our state, I've actually hired technicians and we have surveyed. We're wrapping up Region 7 right now, and that will mean we have surveyed river otters in 7 regions using like a statistically valid, well-designed study designed to look at river otter occupancy in these 7 regions. And we'll use that data during the next fur bearer season setting process to provide that information to the commission and make whatever recommendations we may end up with. But without that data, it's really hard to say, well, Zach says he sees otters all the time, so we should up the quota by 10 more animals. Mm-hmm. That's not the way we like to make decisions. And so it's a long process. It can be arduous when you've had to turn in otters the past couple of years that got caught in your beaver sets. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, one, it wasn't that long ago that the species was quite rare, and that the state, I think, has done a good job of like cautiously expanding opportunity. And it's also a species that is pretty charismatic and has a strong interest from people who have a lot of concern about harvesting this species. So, we are here to provide opportunity, but it's Idaho citizens' animal, not mine, not just the trappers. And so I think our agency's done a good job of balancing all that, as well as, collecting data so we can make an informed decision and not just shoot from the hip moving forward. That small increase you saw was a result from last year. A couple years ago, we did regions 1 through 3 and collected data and then used that in the season setting process. And then we'll use the full project data this next go around.
Too cool. I mean, who are the technicians? Because in my head, right, you keep saying technician to go out and observe. Like, could they be trappers, or are these like licensed biologists going out into these areas? I'm just a point of curiosity for me.
Oh, they could definitely be trappers. I've hired trappers in the past. They tend to be people that have some sort of wildlife biology background, and they're usually have graduated college with a degree in that, although that's not a requirement. And I think the biggest thing with that type of work is that the structure, it's pretty intensive work. And so it's not like, oh, I need you to go do the survey on your weekends that you're free. I mean, for 4.5 months, these technicians, they live out of a truck. They work 8-day shifts. I feel like we are gracious and provide a camper shell for that truck. They're expected to live out of that truck. They have an inflatable ducky raft. And, it isn't like as a trapper where you're like, well, I could set a trap right here at this like nice bottleneck 100 yards upstream of the bridge and catch every otter that swims through. And it's like, well, in our study design, the area, the 12 kilometers that was sampled or selected to be surveyed is actually a 3-mile walk. And then you need to go down in the canyon after you've secured permission from the forest, like the timber company. And then you need to go do the survey. And then I need you to go back and live out of your truck. And I think that sounds awesome. Mm-hmm. But, doing that day in and day out takes a certain type of personality that wants to do it. And, these positions are considered as like a stepping stone in people's career oftentimes. So I'm just going to say they don't pay great. There's no benefits, no sick leave, no annual leave. Like they're out there working hard, gathering data as like a chapter in life. So I think when those things all come together, the pool of people that really want to do that gets pretty small, pretty quick.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, like you said, it sounds enticing, right? Like when you put aside the pay, the benefits, the other things of the adventure, right? But that's pretty cool. Now, staying somewhat on the same topic, just as somebody who has been out in the woods their entire life, who've studied wildlife biology, now works in the role you're in, whatever animal it is you want to pick, what's probably the coolest but most little known fact about a fur bearer?
Ooh.
It could be their habitat. It could be themselves. Just something cool that maybe even a trapper might not know.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to think of like, well, what's something that's nerdy cool that like your average trapper won't know? I mean, one of my favorite animals is the beaver. I love how they can, their lips are made so they can close off their mouth and might still chew underwater without having their mouth open to the water. They're like rabbits. They practice or they do coprophagy. So they'll eat once and then eat their feces again to like run it through a second time.
Okay, so hold on. That's a new fact for me. So what is that called?
Coprophagy.
Coprophagy. Okay, so they eat, defecate, and then they eat those Traeger pellet looking things once more.
Yep.
Interesting.
I'm not saying they do it all the time with every type of forage, but like beavers do that. Just the same way if you've ever raised rabbits, like rabbits do that too.
So is that a nutrient thing?
That's my guess.
Okay.
That would be my suspicion. And then some other cool things like, I find it really interesting that in the strategies in which animals reproduce, things like fisher, like the females give birth in that March-April window, and they immediately breed again. So it seems like in the thing, like the animal's to-do list, right? Like not get eaten, get enough food, successfully reproduce, rear young. For those adult females, like they're doing the giving birth and breeding again, all within like the same few week window. I think that's really fascinating. What are some other fun ones? If you've ever skint a fisher and they're almost like a pit bull, how they have that big fin, that zygote, or that big arch on the top of their head for muscle attachment for strong crushing jaws. Wolverines have it too. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I don't know. River otter's fur is so dense that they don't need oil to keep themselves waterproof. It's just like the water molecules can't get through the hairs, just like you hear about with sea otter. I mean, North American river otter or freshwater otter doesn't have near the fur density that a sea otter does, but I think it's denser than any other of the fur bearers we would harvest.
I know. I just got an otter back yesterday from the tannery, and like every time I get an otter back, like it is always shocking to me how soft, supple, and dense that fur is, which is pretty cool.
Bit of an aside, but I think one of the coolest things of, I've got to capture animals and sell fur in a handful of states now: Missouri, South Dakota, Maine, Arizona, and now Idaho. And I think probably the coolest thing, and I've shared this with some biologists that also find it really fascinating, is like working with these fur buyers, is their ability to see like small scale regional variation based off of the pelts. When I went to school at Mizzou, there was a man named Bill Geiger, and he, coon is king in the Midwest, and like in New England, it's beaver, and out west, it's coyotes or bobcat. And I thought it was so cool that the first time me and two friends from different parts of Missouri, one was from the Ozarks, one was from the Boot Heel where I'm from, and one was from Northwest Missouri, we brought all of our coons up to sell them at the same time. And he told us what portion of the state we were coming from by the pelts, by like the subtle differences in size and pelage color. And it was the same way when I lived in Maine. The folks really had an eye for the intricacies of beaver coloration and quality. And out here in grad school, I got to work for a small fur buyer in the Black Hills, and the way they graded and looked at coyotes, it surpassed craftsmanship, and it reached like artistic. They're not counting noses at that point. They're really appreciating the like nuance of that resource. And I think that's not really like a cool animal fact, but it's something that I have seen in our lifestyle of trappers, that's probably one of the more fascinating things I've got to see.
Yeah, going to some of those fur sales is pretty cool when you see those fur buyers digging around and looking and seeing those subtle things that I don't pick up on. But of course, like none of my stuff seems to be top lot anyways. So, yeah.
Not really a problem of mine either.
Yeah. Another question, like we're kind of starting to run up on time. So I have like a couple lightning round ones. This is going to be a big one though. We've seen what happened in New Mexico with public land trapping. We've seen what's happened in California, whether that's Washington, Oregon, even Montana to a certain extent. But if you had your magic 8-ball, what do you see as the future of trapping?
That's not fair. That's not a lightning round question.
Well, there's more after it, I guess, is the real point.
I think you will continue to see trapping and the use of traps to manage wildlife. And as far as what that looks like is anyone's guess. I mean, they use traps in the Netherlands to manage invasive muskrats and dikes. They kill thousands, but it's not done by a licensed trapper to harvest them and turn them into like beautiful muskrat quilts. So, I mean, I think the tool's not going to go away, and the need for the tool's not going to go away. I think it's kind of up to trappers and the state fish and wildlife agencies to continue to openly communicate about the value and the role of the activity, as well as how it is done and can be done in a sustainable and ethical way that minimizes injury, pain, and suffering to animals. And I think that's probably our best way to ensure that we have the most options when it comes to trapping for years to come.
That makes sense. And then, for trappers or people who are interested in trapping and want to be involved in as much as they can be in like the decisions that are made, especially from like the state agencies, what's the best way for them to go about that or get involved?
I think there's a few ways. I always think like joining different groups, your various trappers organizations in your state or at the nationwide level. And then, getting to know your regional biologists, as well as every 2 years, like in Idaho, every 2 years, we set seasons and rules for furbearer harvest. And so there's the official like public comment periods and to weigh in, to share if you would like to see a change in a season or an expansion or have concerns about something. I think that is always a way. I mentioned earlier I work with AFWA's Furbearer Technical Working Group that's led the BMP process, and I work in their outreach component a lot. And I think some of the most fascinating things that we've learned from my structured surveys of the public is that most people don't even know that trapping exists. And then two, despite what you might hear or like see on your Instagram feed, like most people don't have a strong feeling about this activity one way or the other. They're not anti-trapping and they're not going to go out and buy traps any day, but they're uninformed and they're willing to listen to whoever wants to talk about it. So I don't know, it's kind of a generic response, but really like I think we've worked so hard to be quiet and like kind of hide in the shadows of like, oh, like I don't want people to steal my spot or know what I'm doing. But I think like continuing to conduct your activity in a really ethical, respectful way of all the user groups on the landscape and harvest those animals and not try and hide it and like put yourself out in that uncomfortable situation and have those conversations. That's the other thing we found in these human dimension surveys is that people are much more supportive of trapping if they know someone who does it. And I'm not saying it needs to be their best friend or their family member, but if they know Joe Blow down the street and he traps and he's an okay person, then they're going to be much more likely to, if that ballot box biology ever came their way, to vote in support of this wildlife management tool.
That's a great point. And you also mentioned too about people reaching out to your wildlife biologist. Do you field calls from trappers? And like if a trapper's to say, hey, I want to call Cory and talk to him about fur bearers in my region, like how does that conversation usually go? And what is it about? Like what information can you give to trappers to help them and maybe you get from them as well?
Yeah, so I do field those calls. And, I try and attend our auctions, a series of our auctions and rendezvous and stuff as well to interact with any of the folks that may show up there. But, sorry, just 1 second. I had to silence a call. But yeah, well, I think what's funny is, if you call and you're wanting to know what's the marten status look like in the section of this, the sawtooths you like to trap, I'm going to let more than I do. Because, we may have a good idea about how the trend of marten are doing over a large range or how large-scale fires have impacted marten habitat quality over a mountain range. But, your drainage better than anyone because, you may have trapped it for years and, love your favorite spots. Like you always pull a handful of nice marten out of this draw. So I love to hear those stories and listen and learn from the trapper as much as anything. But yeah, as far as fielding those calls, sometimes it's frustration about our regulations. And I think, my job is to really try and walk you through them. And the point isn't to necessarily get you to agree with it by the end, but the point is that you understand how and where it's coming from.
Well, it's good to hear too, open. And I think trappers too might be hesitant to call, but it sounds like it's as much as it can be an open door policy. And I think it's a good thing to do. And like you mentioned, get to know your local biologist. And, even if it's for big game hunting, I've called biologists for areas I haven't hunted before, and they give great information about, at least trends and drainages, things like that. So definitely take advantage of it if you're listening. Last two questions. So these are two questions I always ask every guest.
Okay.
Lifetime in the woods. What's the wildest experience that you've ever had in the woods? It doesn't have to be trapping related, but what's just the wildest or coolest experience you've had out in the woods?
All right. Again, I got two. My first one, I was doing Mexican spotted owl surveys in the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico. And you work the night shift. So it's dusk and I'm getting set up on my first point that I'm going to call. And so you're doing surveys. You're hiking through the mountains miles every night in the dark with your headlamp. And you go to these strategic points and you call like an owl. And so it's not dark yet. I'm at my first point. And I hear that classic, fawn in distress, meh. And there is a doe mule deer with a fawn and then two coyotes at the heel. And I'm leaning against this big pondo tree, and they're completely oblivious to my presence. And I thought it was a really wild and cool thing to watch, but how those coyotes, it almost looked like a pair of calf ropers. Like one would pick on the mom and get her attention, and then the other one would come and snap at the hocks of the fawn. And they ended up and successfully separated the mom from the fawn, and the fawn bolted and ran into some thick greenery, like vine type stuff, and couldn't move anymore. And then it was over. And I got to watch, it was over for the fawn. And I got to watch the whole thing unfold at 50 yards away. Close enough you can see the spittle from the mom as she's grunting and running around. And then I slip over the ridge, and about that time, after it had kind of was done, and the doe was still really distressed, and she saw me moving, and she came right up to me and was doing, it wasn't stotting the way mule deer do the bouncing thing, but she ran up and started to rear up on her hind legs like she was going to whack me with her front legs. And that was she figured it out that I wasn't part of the coyote pack or anything like that, and ran off. But I don't know, you're 21 years old and you're from a cotton field and you're out in the mountains of the West, and you just got to watch Wild Kingdom unfold in front of you at 50 yards. That was pretty wild.
Yeah, that's pretty dang cool.
Really cool thing to see. Yeah. And when I worked in Southwest Alaska, this will be a short story, but I was doing some brown bear survey work, and a bear stole a salmon from another bear, and they take off up the trail. And I'm just oh my gosh, there's two giant brown bears coming up this trail at me. And it happened so quick. I tried to jump off of the trail, but as I turned my back to them to hop off, run and get off of the trail, my left arm was still kind of stuck in the trail. And the first bear was so close, it hit my arm as it was running and knocked me down. And they could have cared less about me. There was nothing to worry about as far as my personal safety, I don't think. But I touched a brown bear involuntarily when it plowed past me over an argument over a salmon.
Yeah, I'd be having to order a new pair of my government pants after that. That's for sure. That's awesome. And then last question, Cory. It's always a hypothetical. This one I'm not going to have a giant trade-off with, but I've checked in black bears over there at Idaho Fish Game, otters. they all seem to take a little bit of work. So if you had a given day, would you rather have to check in 100 black bears or do 200 otters?
Otters, because I'm the furbearer biologist.
Okay. Fair enough. You got to get the CITES tag and everything situated there. So
Yeah.
Pretty easy. Well, Cory, genuinely thank you for taking the time out of your busy day. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody listening has, for those who have questions, like Cory said, don't be afraid to reach out to your local biologist or Cory himself. Cory, any other parting thoughts or words for people, with anything in particular coming up that people should be aware of, or anywhere that people need to just garner information?
I guess like a couple of things. One is that, like it's end of October, so it's time to get out your traps and get started. And remember that like we do this because we love it, and there's only so many falls. So get out and have some fun. And Idaho's a great state to be a trapper in. And then the second piece is that if you do have really strong interests and would like to see changes in some of our furbearer seasons, like next winter, so is when we'll be setting our new seasons. So that's still a year away, or a year and a couple of months, but those months tick by quicker than you think. And so, if you're interested in it, now's the time, or like in the next, let's say after this winter, so at the summer of 25 is the time to really start talking with your regional biologists, your trappers associations, and getting those interests heard.
Super. Well, everybody, thanks again, Cory, and we'll catch you on another episode of the Okayest Trapper Podcast.
Awesome. Thank you.